The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Prosperity Creek, Wyoming territory, as Charlotte May Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, watching the townspeople go about their daily business. Her delicate fingers traced patterns on the frost-covered glass, a habit she'd developed during the endless mornings of her 19 years in this frontier town. Below, merchants opened their shops. Cowboys drove cattle through the street, and women in calico dresses hurried to the general store, their bonnets shielding them from the harsh autumn wind. Charlotte was everything a frontier lady should be, at least on the surface. Her father, Judge Harrison Whitmore, had ensured she received the finest education available west of the Mississippi. She could play the piano, speak passable French, and embroider with a precision that made the other young ladies green with envy. Her golden hair was always perfectly coiffed, her dresses imported from San Francisco, and her manners impeccable when society demanded it. But beneath the polished exterior beat the heart of a rebel. "Charlotte!" Her mother's shrill voice pierced through the morning quiet. "Samuel Hartley will be here within the hour. For heaven's sake, put on your blue silk. You know it brings out your eyes." Charlotte's jaw tightened. Samuel Hartley, son of the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, with hands that grabbed too freely and breath that reeked of whiskey even at Sunday service. Her parents had been pushing this match for months, seeing only the vast acres of land and heads of cattle that would unite 2 powerful families. "I'd rather wear sackcloth," Charlotte muttered, but dutifully made her way to her wardrobe. The blue silk dress hung there like a prison uniform, its delicate fabric a mockery of the freedom she craved. As she dressed, Charlotte's mind wandered to the books hidden beneath her bed. Adventure stories of women who dressed as men and rode the plains. Tales of love found in unexpected places, far from the suffocating propriety of arranged marriages. She'd read them by candlelight when the house was asleep, imagining herself as the heroine who chose her own destiny. The sound of horses and a carriage approaching made her stomach turn. Through her window, she saw Samuel Hartley step down from his fancy surrey, his thick frame squeezed into a suit that had seen better days. His father, old Martin Hartley, followed, speaking animatedly with Judge Whitmore, who had emerged from the house to greet them. "The wedding could be by Christmas," she heard old Hartley say, his booming voice carrying up to her window. "My boy's eager to settle down, and you're Charlotte's of age. No sense in waiting." Charlotte's hands clenched into fists. They spoke of her as if she were cattle to be traded, her feelings as irrelevant as the wind. She thought of her friend Mary Jensen, who'd been married off at 17 to a man 30 years her senior. Mary's letters had grown fewer and sadder with each passing month, until they stopped altogether. Taking a deep breath, Charlotte descended the stairs, each step feeling like a march to the gallows. In the parlor, the men rose as she entered, Samuel's eyes roving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Miss Charlotte," Samuel said, taking her hand and pressing wet lips to it, "you're looking particularly lovely today." "Mr. Hartley," she replied, retrieving her hand as quickly as propriety allowed. The next hour passed in agony. Samuel spoke of his plans to expand his father's ranch, of the grand house he would build for his bride, of the many sons she would give him. He never once asked her opinion or showed interest in her thoughts. Her mother nodded approvingly at every word, while her father discussed business with Martin Hartley. "Perhaps Miss Charlotte would enjoy a turn about the garden," Samuel suggested, already rising and extending his arm. Charlotte knew this was her moment, the moment they expected her to smile, take his arm, and seal her fate with a demure walk among the roses. Instead, she remained seated. "Actually, Mr. Hartley, I have something to say." The room fell silent. Her mother's face paled. "Charlotte, dear," her mother began, but Charlotte raised her hand. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Hartley, but I must decline your suit. I have no intention of marrying you, now or ever." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel's face turned from red to purple. His father sputtered in indignation, and her own father's expression grew thunderous. "Charlotte May Whitmore." Judge Whitmore's voice was deadly quiet. "You will apologize this instant." "No, father, I will not." Charlotte stood, her chin raised despite the trembling in her knees. "I will not be sold like property to the highest bidder. I will not spend my life bearing children for a man who sees me as nothing more than a broodmare. I choose my own path. You choose? Her father's laugh was bitter. You foolish girl, you have no choice. You are my daughter, living under my roof, eating my food. You will marry whom I say. Then I choose to leave your roof, Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Old Martin Hartley stood abruptly. Harrison, I see your household lacks proper discipline. When you've dealt with this rebellion, perhaps we can discuss business again. Come, Samuel. Samuel cast one last furious glance at Charlotte before following his father out. The door slammed behind them with finality. You've ruined us, her mother wailed. The shame! No decent man will have you now. Judge Whitmore's face had gone from red to a dangerous white. You want to choose your own path? Very well, you'll have your choice, Charlotte. But not the one you think. Charlotte met his gaze steadily, though fear crept up her spine at his tone. By the power vested in me, as circuit judge of this territory, her father continued, his voice formal and cold, I hereby decree that Charlotte May Whitmore shall be married within the week. Since she refuses a suitable match, she shall marry the first unmarried man who'll have her, be he beggar, drunkard, or servant. Let's see how she enjoys her choice, then. Harrison, you can't, her mother gasped. I can, and I will. She wants to reject privilege. Let her live without it. Post the notice, Margaret. Our daughter will marry whoever answers the call. The lower their station, the better the lesson. Charlotte stood frozen, the full weight of his words crushing down upon her. In trying to escape one prison, she'd condemned herself to something potentially far worse. Her father turned and left the room, her mother following, leaving Charlotte alone with the bitter taste of her rebellion. As the sun began to set over Prosperity Creek, casting the town in shades of amber and rust, Charlotte remained in the parlor, staring at the spot where her future had been decided. She'd wanted choice, and now she would have it. The choice between accepting whatever fate her father's cruel decree brought or finding some way to escape before the week was out. But in a frontier town where everyone knew everyone, where her father's word was law, and where a young woman alone had few options, Charlotte began to realize that her defiance might have cost her more than she'd ever imagined. The sound of her father's pen scratching as he wrote the marriage notice in his study echoed through the house like a death knell. By morning, all of Prosperity Creek would know that Judge Whitmore's proud daughter was to be married off to whoever would take her, a punishment designed to break her spirit and serve as a warning to any other young woman who dared to defy the natural order of things. Charlotte climbed the stairs to her room, each step heavier than the last. At her window, she looked out again at the town that had been her whole world, wondering what stranger would soon have the right to call her wife. The autumn wind rattled the panes, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a wild, free sound that made her heart ache with longing for the freedom she'd likely never know. The week passed in a blur of whispered conversations and pointed stares. Charlotte had become the scandal of Prosperity Creek, her father's decree posted prominently outside the courthouse for all to see. Some men had inquired, drifters seeking easy fortune, drunkards looking for someone to cook and clean. But Judge Whitmore had turned them all away. He wanted someone specific, Charlotte realized, someone whose station would serve as the ultimate humiliation. On the morning of the 7th day, Charlotte stood before her mirror in a simple gray dress, her mother fussing behind her with disapproving clucks. The wedding dress laid out was plain white cotton, a far cry from the ivory silk she'd once dreamed of wearing. Thomas Beckett, her mother spat the name like a curse. A stable hand. Your father has truly lost his mind. Charlotte's hands trembled as she pinned up her hair. Thomas Beckett. She'd seen him around town, mucking stalls at the livery, hauling water for the hotel, doing whatever labor would earn him a meal. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair that always seemed to need cutting and clothes that bore the patches of hardware. She'd never heard him speak more than a few words, always yes sir or right away ma'am, with his eyes downcast. At least he's not a drunkard, Charlotte said quietly, trying to find some small comfort. Her mother whirled on her. Not a drunkard, he's a servant. You'll be cooking over a wood stove, washing his filthy clothes in lye soap, living in whatever hovel he can afford, if he can afford anything at all. This is what your pride has brought you. The church bells began to ring, summoning them to Charlotte's fate. The walk to the small Methodist church felt like a funeral procession. Townspeople lined the streets, some with sympathy in their eyes, others with the satisfied smirks of those who enjoyed seeing the mighty brought low. Inside the church, a handful of people had gathered. Her parents, the minister, Reverend Walsh, Mrs. Patterson from the general store who served as witness, and there, standing awkwardly by the altar, Thomas Beckett. He'd tried to clean himself up. His dark hair was slicked back with water, his face freshly shaved, revealing a strong jaw she'd never noticed before. He wore what must have been a borrowed suit, too short in the sleeves and tight across his broad shoulders built from years of hard labor. When he looked up and met her eyes, Charlotte was startled to see they were a deep green, like pine needles after rain. Thomas quickly looked away, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He looked as trapped as she felt. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Walsh began, his voice heavy with disapproval, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Charlotte May Whitmore and Thomas James Beckett in holy matrimony." The words washed over Charlotte like a bad dream. Her father stood rigid in the front pew, satisfaction written across his face. This was his justice, his rebellious daughter married to a man who shoveled horse manure for a living. "Do you, Thomas, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Thomas's voice was quiet but steady. "I do." "Do you, Charlotte, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Charlotte closed her eyes. One last moment of choice, though what choice was there really? Refuse and face complete ruin, or accept and hope for what? She opened her eyes and found Thomas looking at her with something that might have been understanding, or perhaps pity. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. You may, kiss your bride." Thomas stepped forward hesitantly. Charlotte braced herself, but he merely took her hand and pressed the lightest kiss to her knuckles, so gentle she barely felt it. His hand was calloused but warm, and he released hers immediately, stepping back as if he'd overstepped. There was no reception, no celebration. Her father signed the marriage certificate with a flourish and handed Thomas a small purse. "That's her dowry," he said coldly. "Such as it is. She's your responsibility now, Beckett. See that you keep her in line." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he merely nodded and tucked the purse inside his jacket. Charlotte's mother embraced her stiffly. "You've made your bed," she whispered. "May God help you lie in it." And then they were gone, leaving Charlotte standing beside her new husband on the church steps, her entire world reduced to this moment and this stranger. "I've got a wagon," Thomas said quietly, the first real words he'd spoken to her. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a slight rasp to it. "Your things, I loaded them already. Your father had them sent over." Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice. They walked to a rickety wagon pulled by an old mule, her trunk and a few boxes loaded in the back. Thomas helped her up onto the seat, his hands careful not to linger at her waist. The ride out of town was silent, except for the creak of wheels and the mule's occasional snort. Charlotte kept her eyes forward, aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Thomas drove with steady hands, navigating the rutted road that led away from Prosperity Creek and into the open prairie. After what seemed like hours but was probably less than one, Thomas turned the wagon down a narrow track. In the distance, Charlotte saw a small cabin, weather-beaten but sturdy-looking, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. A few chickens pecked in the yard, and she could see a vegetable garden to one side. "It's not much," Thomas said, the first words he'd spoken since they'd left town. "But the roof doesn't leak and the well's good." He helped her down from the wagon and began unloading her things. Charlotte stood in the yard, looking at what was now her home. It was smaller than her father's library, the whole structure probably fitting into their formal dining room. But there were wildflowers growing along the porch rails, and the windows, though small, were clean. Inside was sparse but neat. A main room with a fireplace, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the hearth. A ladder led to what must be a loft, and a curtained doorway suggested a small bedroom. Everything was clean, scrubbed raw, as if Thomas had spent days preparing for her arrival. "The bedroom's through there," Thomas said, setting down her trunk. I'll sleep in the loft." Charlotte turned to look at him, surprised. The loft? His face reddened. It wouldn't be proper otherwise. You didn't choose this, Mrs. Beckett. I won't. That is, I don't expect. He stopped, clearly uncomfortable. But we're married, Charlotte said, confused by his hesitation. Thomas met her eyes then, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Respect, perhaps, or a decency she hadn't expected. Legal married? Yes, he said quietly. But that doesn't give me rights to anything you're not willing to give. You were forced into this. I won't force anything else on you. That night, Charlotte lay in the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie. Coyotes in the distance, wind through the grass, the creak of the cabin settling. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thomas moving about in the main room, banking the fire, and then the quiet as he climbed to the loft. She'd expected the worst, a man who would claim his husbandly rights regardless of her feelings, who would see her as property won through her father's cruel game. Instead, she'd found someone who had given her the only thing no one else had, the choice of whether or not to be truly married. Pulling the rough blanket up to her chin, Charlotte stared at the ceiling, wondering who this man was who shoveled stalls by day but understood dignity and choice better than anyone in her privileged world ever had. The moonlight streamed through the small window, and somewhere above, she heard the creak of the loft as Thomas settled onto what she imagined must be an uncomfortable pallet on the floor. Her wedding night, spent alone in a narrow bed in a cabin on the prairie, was nothing like she'd ever imagined. But for the first time in a week, Charlotte felt something other than despair. Perhaps it was too early to call it hope, but it was something. A tiny spark of possibility that maybe, just maybe, her father's punishment had delivered her not to humiliation, but to something else entirely. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was Thomas's quiet breathing from the loft above, steady and reassuring as the heartbeat of the house itself. The first morning in her new life, Charlotte woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment she forgot where she was, expecting to see her rose-papered walls and velvet curtains. Instead, rough wooden beams stared back at her, and sunlight streamed through a simple calico curtain. She dressed quickly in her plainest dress, still far too fine for a cabin, and ventured into the main room. Thomas was already gone, but he'd left coffee warming on the stove and a plate of biscuits covered with a clean cloth. Beside the plate was a note, written in careful, blocky letters. At the stable, back by noon, eggs in the basket, tea. Charlotte poured herself coffee in a tin cup, so different from her mother's china, and stepped onto the porch. The morning stretched endlessly before her, prairie grass waving in the wind as far as she could see. No neighbors in sight, no social calls to make, no piano to practice. Just her in this vast, empty space. She spent the morning exploring her new domain. The vegetable garden was well tended, with neat rows of beans, squash, and turnips. The chicken coop held 6 hens and a proud rooster. Behind the cabin, she found a small smokehouse and a root cellar dug into the hillside. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work. When Thomas returned at noon, he found her attempting to make lunch, struggling with the wood stove that seemed to have a mind of its own. "It's got a temperament," he said from the doorway, making her jump. "You have to sweet-talk it some." He moved past her, adjusting the damper with practiced ease until the flames settled into a steady burn. This close, Charlotte could smell hay and horses on him, mixed with something else, leather, perhaps, and fresh air. "I can manage," she said stiffly, embarrassed to be found failing at such a simple task. "I know you can," Thomas replied, stepping back, "but there's no shame in learning. This is different from what you're used to." He washed his hands at the pump, then surprised her by starting to prepare lunch himself, slicing bread, portioning out cold meat and cheese, all with an efficiency that spoke of years of self-sufficiency. "You cook?" Charlotte asked. "Had to learn. Been on my own since I was 14. He set 2 plates on the table. Ma died of fever. Pa followed her a month later. Been making my way ever since. They ate in awkward silence, Charlotte trying to reconcile this man with the silent stable hand she'd glimpsed in town. When he'd finished, Thomas pushed back from the table. "I need to ask you something," he said, his green eyes serious. "Can you read and write?" Charlotte bristled. "Of course I can. I had the finest tutors, No, I mean, he rubbed the back of his neck, color rising in his cheeks. Could you teach me, proper like? I know my letters some, can sign my name and read simple words, but… He gestured at her note from the morning. Took me near 10 minutes to write that. Charlotte stared at him. You want me to teach you? I'd pay you for it. Not money, don't have much of that. But I could trade work. Fix things up nicer around here, build you whatever you might need. I've always wanted to read proper, but never had the chance. There was a hunger in his voice that Charlotte recognized, the same yearning she'd felt reading her adventure books by candlelight. Why? She asked softly. Thomas looked out the window, his jaw working. Man who can't read is always at someone else's mercy. Can't check if he's being cheated, can't learn new things except by watching. Can't. He paused, then continued quietly. Can't read the Bible for himself. Has to trust what others tell him it says. I'll teach you, Charlotte said, surprised by how quickly the words came. And you don't need to pay me. We're married. What's mine is yours. His smile transformed his face, and Charlotte found herself staring. When he wasn't scowling at the ground or wearing that careful, guarded expression, Thomas Beckett was actually handsome in a rough-hewn way. That afternoon, he showed her around the homestead properly. He knew every plant on the prairie, every bird call, every sign of weather changing. See that? He pointed to a hawk circling overhead. Redtail means field mice are active. Good day for the barn cats in town. He showed her which plants were edible, which could be used for medicine, where to find water if the well ran dry. How do you know all this? Charlotte asked, fascinated despite herself. When you work outdoors all day, you learn to pay attention. The land teaches you if you're willing to listen. He knelt by a cluster of purple flowers. Prairie aster. Blooms late, means frost is coming soon. As they walked, Thomas kept a careful distance between them, never assuming familiarity. But Charlotte found herself moving closer, drawn by his quiet enthusiasm as he shared his knowledge. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread that Thomas apologized for, though Charlotte found it surprisingly satisfying, they sat by the fire. Charlotte had found a slate and chalk in her things, and they began his first proper lesson. A is for apple, she said, writing the letter carefully. A is for axe, Thomas countered, his large hand awkward around the chalk as he copied her letter. More useful out here than apples. Charlotte smiled despite herself. B is for book. B is for bucket, Thomas said, grinning now. Or barn, or beans. Lord knows we eat enough of them. They worked through the alphabet, Thomas turning each letter into something practical, something from his world. His concentration was intense, his brow furrowed as he formed each letter over and over until it was right. You're a quick learner, Charlotte said as he successfully wrote his full name for the first time. Got a good teacher, he replied, then colored as if the compliment was too forward. When the fire burned low, Thomas stood and stretched. I'll bank the fire. You should get your rest. Charlotte watched him move about the cabin, securing it for the night. 3 days ago, she'd been prepared to marry Samuel Hartley and live in luxury. Now she sat in a 2-room cabin with a man who shoveled stalls for a living, and yet she felt more seen, more valued than she ever had in her father's grand house. Thomas, she called as he headed for the ladder to the loft. He paused, looking back. Thank you for everything, for not. You don't need to thank me for treating you decent, he said quietly. That's just what a man should do. Later, lying in the narrow bed, Charlotte listened to the night sounds of the prairie. Above, she heard Thomas settling in for another night on the hard loft floor. She thought about his hands, careful and patient as he formed letters, the way his eyes lit up when he successfully read a word, the quiet pride in his voice as he'd shown her his land. Her father had meant to humiliate her, to break her spirit by chaining her to someone beneath her station. But Judge Whitmore, for all his education and power, had never looked at her the way Thomas did, as if she had something valuable to offer beyond her pretty face and social graces. She was beginning to understand that there were different kinds of wealth, different kinds of education. Thomas might not know his letters, but he could read the land like a book. He might not have money, but he had dignity, kindness, and a curious mind eager to learn. The divide between them was vast. The judge's daughter and the stable hand, the educated lady and the laborer. But perhaps, Charlotte thought as sleep began to claim her, perhaps that divide wasn't as insurmountable as she'd first believed. A coyote howled in the distance, and the cabin creaked gently in the wind. Above her, she heard Thomas shift on his pallet and found the sound oddly comforting. Whatever else her father's punishment had brought her, it had brought her to this. A simple cabin on the prairie with a man who asked nothing of her but the gift of learning, who offered nothing but respect and the space to choose her own path. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but as Charlotte drifted off to sleep, she wondered if it might be something better. A life built not on obligation and society's expectations, but on mutual respect and the slow, careful building of something real. The autumn weeks passed in a rhythm Charlotte had never known. Simple, purposeful, and strangely satisfying. Every evening after supper, she and Thomas would sit by the fire with the slate and chalk, and now, with precious paper and ink he'd saved wages to buy. His progress was remarkable, driven by a hunger for knowledge that touched something deep within her. The quick, brown fox. Thomas read slowly from the primer Charlotte had found in her trunk, his finger following each word. Jumps over the lazy dog. He looked up, pride shining in his green eyes. I read it straight through. You did, Charlotte said, unable to hide her smile. Now try this one. She handed him a slightly more challenging passage, watching as his brow furrowed in concentration. In the lamplight, she could see the calluses on his hands, the small scars from years of labor. Yet those same rough hands held the book with reverence. Some words are like horses, Thomas said after struggling with a particularly difficult sentence. You got to approach them easy, get to know their temperament. Charlotte laughed. A real laugh, not the polite titter she'd perfected in society. I never thought of it that way. Everything makes sense if you relate it to what you know, he said, then added shyly. You're a natural teacher, Charlotte, patient-like. It was the first time he'd used her given name without the formal Mrs. Beckett, and something warm bloomed in her chest. As the weeks progressed, their lessons evolved beyond simple reading. Thomas would share stories he'd heard over the years, tales from other ranch hands, legends passed down from Mexican vaqueros, accounts of Indian raids and frontier justice. His memory was extraordinary, able to recall conversations word for word from years past. Never had a way to write them down, he explained one evening. So I kept them up here. He tapped his temple. Now I can finally put them to paper. Charlotte helped him write his first complete story, a tale about a wild Mustang that had evaded capture for 3 years. His natural storytelling ability shone through, and Charlotte found herself genuinely moved by his simple, honest prose. This is wonderful, Thomas, she said, reading his finished work. You have a gift. He ducked his head, color rising in his cheeks. It's just campfire talk. No, Charlotte insisted. It's more than that. You see things others miss. You make the ordinary beautiful. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the air between them. Thomas looked away first, clearing his throat. I have something for you, he said abruptly, rising from the table. He disappeared into the bedroom and returned with something wrapped in brown paper. It's not much, but, well, you'll see. Charlotte unwrapped it carefully to find a small wooden box, beautifully carved with wildflowers, the same prairie asters he'd shown her that first day. You made this? Winter evenings get long. Learned whittling from an old-timer at the stable. He shifted nervously. Thought you might need something to keep your letters in, your personal things. I know you're used to finer— It's perfect, Charlotte interrupted, running her fingers over the delicate carving. It's the most thoughtful gift anyone's ever given me. Thomas's smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. That night, Charlotte lay awake thinking about the man sleeping in the loft above. She'd begun to notice things, how he always ensured she had the best portion at meals while claiming he wasn't hungry, how he'd quietly reinforced the chicken coop after mentioning he'd seen fox tracks, how he brought her wildflowers for the table, but always arranged them where she'd see them first thing in the morning. She thought, too, about his mind, sharp and curious beneath the humble exterior. His questions during lessons showed deep thinking. Why were certain letters shaped as they were? How had language developed? Who decided which words meant what? He connected ideas in unexpected ways, drawing parallels between breaking horses and understanding grammar rules, between reading weather signs and interpreting meaning in text. One evening, a cold snap brought the first serious frost. Thomas worked late securing the animals and checking the cabin's chinking. He came in half frozen, his lips blue with cold. "Sit by the fire," Charlotte ordered, pulling the rocking chair closer to the hearth. "You'll catch your death." She made him hot coffee, added an extra blanket to his chair, and found herself fussing over him in a way that would have shocked her society friends. When he dozed off in the chair, exhausted from the long day, she stood watching him sleep. In repose, the careful guard he always maintained relaxed. She could see the boy he must have been, orphaned and alone. She could see, too, the man he was, kind, intelligent, honorable in ways that had nothing to do with birth or wealth. Quietly, she fetched a quilt and draped it over him. He stirred, eyes opening sleepily. "Charlotte," his voice was rough with sleep. "What time? I should rest," she said softly. "You've earned it." He caught her hand as she turned away. "I need to tell you something." His green eyes were serious in the firelight. "These past weeks, teaching me, it's meant more than you know. Never had anyone believe I could learn like this. You're selling yourself short, Thomas. You have one of the finest minds I've encountered. You don't need to say that. I'm not being kind. I'm being truthful." She squeezed his hand, noting how natural it felt to touch him. "My father's tutors were learned men, but half of them couldn't think an original thought. You see the world differently. You make connections others miss. That's intelligence, Thomas, regardless of whether you can conjugate Latin verbs." He was quiet for a long moment, their hands still linked. "Sometimes I forget this was meant as punishment for you," he said finally. "Being married to me." Charlotte's heart clenched. "I haven't thought of it that way in weeks." "What do you think of it as, then?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Charlotte found herself leaning closer, drawn by something stronger than propriety or reason. "I think," she said slowly, "that my father did me a favor he never intended." Thomas's breath caught. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, work-roughened thumb gentle against her skin. "Charlotte, A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks, breaking the moment. Thomas pulled back, the careful distance reasserting itself. "It's late," he said roughly. "You should get your rest." But that night, Charlotte heard him pacing in the loft above, restless as she was. She pressed her hand to her cheek where he touched her, wondering at the turn her life had taken. She'd been raised to value education, refinement, social graces, all the things Thomas lacked. Yet in teaching him, she'd learned lessons of her own about dignity, hard work, and the different forms wisdom could take. She thought of the notebook where Thomas now wrote daily, observations about the land, stories from his past, and increasingly shy attempts at what could only be called poetry. Last week, she'd found a page where he'd written her name over and over, practicing his penmanship, each iteration more careful than the last. The man who couldn't read when they married was now devouring every book she had, asking for more. He'd even started teaching her in return how to read animal tracks, predict weather changes, understand the subtle language of the prairie. They were teaching each other, she realized, building something together neither could create alone. As sleep finally claimed her, Charlotte smiled at the thought of tomorrow's lesson. Thomas had asked about Shakespeare, having heard quotes from the ranch hands. She'd promised to introduce him to the plays, already imagining his reaction to the poetry and drama. The stable hand who'd stood awkwardly at the altar was revealing himself to be so much more. A natural philosopher, a gifted storyteller, a man of profound depth, waiting only for someone to hand him the keys to unlock it. And she, the spoiled judge's daughter, was finding purpose and partnership in the last place she'd expected. Her father's punishment was becoming her unexpected gift, one careful lesson at a time. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, earlier and harsher than anyone in Prosperity Creek could remember. The first blizzard struck in early November, catching everyone off guard. Thomas had been in town when it hit, and Charlotte spent 6 hours alone in the cabin, keeping the fire burning and praying he'd found shelter. when he finally stumbled through the door near midnight, covered in snow and ice. She flew to him without thinking. "Thank God," she breathed, helping him out of his frozen coat. "I was so worried." His teeth chattered too badly to speak, but the look in his eyes said everything. Charlotte guided him to the fire, pulled off his boots, and wrapped him in every blanket they owned. Only when color returned to his face did her heart beat slow. "Storm caught me at the livery," he managed finally. "Had to wait it out. Kept thinking about you here alone." "I was fine," Charlotte said, though her hands still trembled. "But Thomas, we need supplies for winter, real supplies." He nodded grimly. They'd been making do, but this storm was a warning. The next morning they took inventory. Flour running low, salt pork nearly gone, firewood adequate, but not abundant. The meager savings Thomas had were already depleted from buying Charlotte warmer clothes and boots suitable for prairie life. "I'll take on extra work," Thomas said. "Johnson at the lumber mill needs hands." But work was scarce as winter tightened its grip. The wealthy families had already hired their winter help, and those who might have employed Thomas made it clear they wanted nothing to do with Judge Whitmore's disgraced daughter or her stable-hand husband. Charlotte sold her pearl earrings to a traveling merchant for far less than they were worth. Thomas's face went tight when he found out, but he said nothing. She knew his pride was wounded, but they needed flour and beans more than she needed jewelry. The second blizzard lasted 3 days. Halfway through, they ran out of firewood in the house, and Thomas had to fight his way to the woodpile, using a rope tied between the door and the shed to find his way back in the whiteout conditions. Charlotte had never known such fear as those long minutes waiting for the rope to go taut, signaling his return. Food became a constant worry. Thomas hunted when weather allowed, but game was scarce. They stretched every meal, made soup from bones twice over, saved every scrap. Charlotte learned to make bread that used less flour, to find filling in foods she'd have turned her nose up at months before. One particularly lean week, Thomas gave her his portions, claiming he'd eaten at the stable. Charlotte knew he was lying but couldn't bring herself to challenge him, not when she saw how his clothes hung looser each day. It was the children who changed things. The Kowalski family lived 2 miles east, Polish immigrants with 5 children and a hard-scrabble farm. When their father broke his leg falling from a roof, the family faced starvation. Word spread through the sparse community, but help was limited. Everyone was struggling. "We have to do something," Charlotte said when she heard. Thomas looked at their nearly empty pantry. "Charlotte, we barely have—" "I know, but those children—" She thought of the youngest, barely 3 years old. "I can't sit here knowing they're hungry." Something shifted in Thomas's face. "You're right. We share what we have." They loaded up half their remaining supplies, a painful sacrifice, and made the treacherous journey to the Kowalski farm. The gratitude in Mrs. Kowalski's eyes made Charlotte's own tears flow, but it was what happened next that surprised them. Mrs. Kowalski, through broken English, mentioned that her eldest daughter, Anna, age 12, was bright but couldn't attend school in town. Too far to walk in winter, and the family couldn't spare her help anyway. "I could teach her," Charlotte offered impulsively. "If you could spare her 1 afternoon a week." Mrs. Kowalski's eyes lit up. Yes, and I teach her to sew. She help you. Make trade?" Soon, Anna Kowalski was joining Thomas for lessons. Her quick mind absorbed everything, and her help with mending and household tasks was invaluable. Word spread. The Hendricks family asked if their boy could join lessons in exchange for preserved vegetables from their root cellar. The widow Martinez offered dried beans for teaching her nephew. Within weeks, Charlotte's kitchen table hosted 6 children every Sunday afternoon. Payment came in food, firewood, labor, whatever families could spare. Thomas built a larger table, added benches, created a makeshift classroom in their small space. He also became part of the teaching. While Charlotte handled reading and arithmetic, Thomas taught practical skills: how to mend harnesses, basic carpentry, animal husbandry. His patience with the children matched hers, and his creative explanations made complex ideas simple. "Mr. Thomas," young Pete Hendricks said one afternoon, "how come you know so much if you're just learning to read?" Thomas smiled. "Reading's just one kind of learning, Pete. Every person you meet knows something you don't. Smart man pays attention to all of it. The children adored him. He carved wooden letters for the youngest to trace, created counting games with beans and stones, never made anyone feel foolish for not understanding. Charlotte watched him work with the 8-year-old struggling with numbers, his big hands gentle as he guided small fingers, and felt her heart constrict with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. The community noticed. Families who'd snubbed them in town began nodding in acknowledgement. The pastor's wife brought them a ham at Christmas, claiming she'd made too many. The blacksmith offered Thomas extra work, suddenly needing help he'd managed without before. But it was more than just acceptance. Charlotte saw how the children's progress affected their families. Fathers who couldn't read asked their children to teach them letters. Mothers practiced numbers to help with household accounts. The hunger for learning spread like wildfire through the immigrant community, where education had been a luxury none could afford. One brutal January night, with wind howling and temperature dropping, the Kowalskis' eldest boy arrived at their door. His mother was in labor, complications, and the midwife was snowed in across the valley. "Please," he gasped in accented English. "Mother says Mrs. Charlotte knows healing." Charlotte had only basic knowledge from her governess, but she couldn't refuse. She and Thomas fought through the storm to the Kowalski farm. For 12 hours, Charlotte did her best with what little she knew, while Thomas kept the other children calm, the fire burning, and Mr. Kowalski from panic. When the baby finally arrived, healthy despite the dramatic entrance, Charlotte collapsed in exhaustion. Thomas caught her, held her upright, his presence solid and reassuring. "You did it," he whispered against her hair. "You saved them both." "We did it," she corrected, too tired to care about propriety as she leaned into his strength. They stayed until the midwife arrived the next day, Thomas chopping wood and tending animals while Charlotte helped with the new baby and household. When they finally returned home, they found their porch loaded with gifts, preserved food, firewood, a side of smoked venison. The community had responded to their generosity in kind. That night, sitting before their own fire, stomachs full for the first time in weeks, Charlotte looked at Thomas across the table. His face was weathered from the harsh winter, his hands scarred from extra labor, but his eyes held a contentment she'd never seen before. "We're not just surviving anymore," she said softly. "We're building something." Thomas nodded. "Teaching those children, helping the families. It matters. More than any work I've done before." "My father thought marrying me to you would be my punishment," Charlotte said, voicing what they'd both been thinking. "But look what we've created. A school where none existed. A community where there were just scattered farms. Hope where there was resignation." "You created that," Thomas said firmly. "Your teaching, your generosity. Our teaching, our generosity." Charlotte reached across the table, took his calloused hand in hers. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. Won't do it without you." Thomas turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. In the firelight, Charlotte could see everything in his eyes. Respect deepened to admiration, admiration warmed to affection, affection grown into something stronger, waiting only for permission to be acknowledged. Outside, winter raged on, but inside their small cabin, something had fundamentally changed. They were no longer two people forced together by circumstances, enduring parallel loneliness. They were partners, building something meaningful from the ashes of her father's punishment. The winter that had threatened to break them had instead forged them into something stronger. A team, a force for good in their small corner of the frontier. And perhaps, Charlotte thought as Thomas squeezed her hand, something more. Spring arrived like a miracle after the harsh winter, painting the prairie in wildflowers and fresh green grass. Charlotte stood in the doorway one April morning, breathing in the sweet air, when she heard Thomas approaching from the barn. He carried an armload of early wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, prairie roses, and bluebonnets. "For the table," he said, as he always did, but his eyes lingered on her face. "They're beautiful," Charlotte said, taking the bouquet. Their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. That evening, after the supper dishes were cleared and the lesson books put away, an unusual tension filled the cabin. They sat by the fire as always, but something had shifted. Charlotte darned a sock while Thomas carved a new toy for the youngest Kowalski child, but both kept stealing glances at each other. "Charlotte," Thomas said suddenly, setting down his knife. "I need to say something." Her heart began to race. "Yes?" He stood, paced to the window, then back to the fire. "When we married, I promised I wouldn't. That is, I said I'd wait until you were willing. I've kept that promise." "You have," Charlotte said softly, setting aside her mending. "But I'm not made of stone." His voice was rough. "These months, working beside you, watching you with the children, seeing your kindness. Charlotte, He stopped, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm not good with words like you are." Charlotte stood, moved closer to him. "Then don't use words." Thomas's eyes darkened. "You don't mean that. You can't. I'm still just a stable hand who can barely write his name." "No," Charlotte said firmly. "You're the man who gave me a choice when no one else would, who shared his last piece of bread with hungry children, who stays up late studying by candlelight because you're determined to better yourself, who sees beauty in this hard land and taught me to see it too. Charlotte, you're the man who makes me laugh with your observations, who respects my mind, who treats me as an equal partner. Her voice broke slightly. "You're the man I love." The words hung between them like a physical presence. Thomas stood frozen, his green eyes wide with disbelief. "You love me?" he whispered. "Completely," Charlotte admitted, her heart pounding. "These months have shown me what real partnership looks like, what real respect feels like, what real love is. Not the polite arrangement my parents wanted, but this choosing each other every day, building something together, being better together than we could ever be apart." Thomas crossed the space between them in 2 strides, cupping her face in his calloused hands. "Charlotte, my beautiful, brilliant Charlotte, I've loved you since that first night when you didn't look at me with disgust or pity, but like I was a person worth knowing. Every day since has only made me love you more." "Then why do we keep sleeping apart?" Charlotte asked, her hands coming up to cover his. "Why do we maintain this distance when everything in me wants to be close to you?" "Because you deserve better than—" Charlotte silenced him with her lips, pouring all her frustration, longing, and love into the kiss. Thomas froze for a heartbeat, then responded with a passion that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling. "There is no better," Charlotte said firmly. "There's only you, only us, only this life we're building. I choose you, Thomas Beckett, not because I have to, but because I want to, because I can't imagine my life without you in it." Thomas searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or obligation. Finding none, he smiled, that transformative smile that made him impossibly handsome. "Then choose me," he said simply. "Be my wife in truth, not just in law." Charlotte's answer was to take his hand and lead him toward the bedroom, not the grand chamber of her father's house, but the simple room where she'd slept alone all these months. At the threshold, she paused, suddenly shy. Thomas understood. "We don't have to—" "I want to," Charlotte interrupted. "I've wanted to for weeks, maybe longer. I just needed to be sure you wanted me for me, not because you felt it was owed." "Charlotte," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "nothing between us will ever be about owing. Only giving, only sharing, only choosing each other." That night, in the narrow bed that had seemed so lonely before, Charlotte discovered what her married friends had only hinted at. But it was more than physical joining. It was the culmination of months of growing together, learning together, building trust and respect and deep affection. Thomas was as gentle and attentive as he'd been in everything else, making sure she felt treasured, valued, loved. Afterward, they lay entwined, Charlotte's head on Thomas's chest, listening to his heartbeat. His fingers combed through her unbound hair, and she felt a contentment she'd never known existed. "No more loft," she said drowsily. "This is where you belong." "This is where I belong," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Next to you, always." They talked quietly through the night. Dreams for their school, plans for expanding the cabin, hopes for the future they were building. When Charlotte mentioned wanting to start a lending library with her remaining books, Thomas's arms tightened around her. "That's why I love you," he said. "Always thinking of ways to lift others up." "I learned that from you," Charlotte reminded him. "You showed me that real wealth isn't in money or position, but in community, in connections, in making a difference." As dawn broke, painting their room in soft gold, they made love again, slower this time, savoring each touch and whisper. Charlotte marveled at how natural it felt, how right to be in Thomas's arms. Later, as Thomas made breakfast, he insisted, saying she should rest. Charlotte watched him move about their kitchen with easy familiarity. How had she ever thought him beneath her? This man who could read the weather in cloud formations, who carved beauty from scraps of wood, who approached Shakespeare with the same determined intensity he brought to breaking horses. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, setting a plate before her. "How blind I was," Charlotte admitted. "How much I would have missed if Father hadn't forced this marriage." Thomas sat beside her, took her hand. "Maybe we should thank him." Charlotte laughed. "I'm not quite that forgiving yet, but Thomas, I'm happy, truly, deeply happy." "Are you?" His answer was in his eyes, in the way he brought her hand to his lips, in the gentle reverence of his touch. "Happier than I ever dreamed a man like me could be. You've given me the world, Charlotte. Letters and words and books, yes, but more than that. You've given me purpose, partnership, love. You've made me feel worthy." "You were always worthy," Charlotte said fiercely. "I just helped you see it." They spent that spring day like newlyweds should, stealing kisses between chores, finding excuses to touch, planning their future with giddy excitement. When the Kowalski children arrived for their Sunday lesson, they noticed the change immediately. "Mrs. Charlotte's glowing," Anna whispered to her brother in Polish. Thomas heard and grinned, pulling Charlotte close. "That's what happiness does," he told the children. "When you find the right person, everything glows a little brighter." That night, as they lay together in their bed, Charlotte thought with deep satisfaction. She reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from that awful morning when her father decreed her punishment, through the awkward early days, the slow building of respect, the winter that tested them, to this perfect unity of hearts and minds and bodies. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Thomas replied, his arms secure around her. "Today, tomorrow, always." Outside, coyotes called to each other across the prairie, and the wind whispered through the grass. But inside their cabin, Charlotte and Thomas had created their own world, one built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and a love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning into something beautiful and lasting. Their marriage had begun as a punishment. It had become a gift neither of them could have imagined. A love story written not in grand gestures, but in small daily choices to see the best in each other, to build something meaningful together, to choose love over pride or prejudice. And as Charlotte drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she knew with bone-deep certainty that this simple cabin, this hard-working man, this life of purpose and partnership, was exactly where she belonged. By summer, the changes in Thomas and Charlotte's life had become the talk of Prosperity Creek. The makeshift school in their cabin had grown to 15 regular students, with more families inquiring each week. Thomas had built additional benches and even a proper blackboard after Charlotte mentioned missing one from her teaching. The transformation in Thomas himself was even more remarkable. He now read fluently, wrote letters for illiterate townspeople for a small fee, and had begun keeping detailed records for the livery stable, earning him a raise and newfound respect from his employer. When he walked through town, he carried himself differently, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence. Mr. Beckett, the bank manager, Harold Morrison, called out one day as Thomas deposited his wages. "I heard you've been teaching the Simpson boys arithmetic. My own son is struggling with his figures. Would you consider taking on another student?" The request stunned both Thomas and Charlotte. The Morrisons were among the town's elite, the very people who had shunned them after their marriage. Yet here was the banker, hat in hand, asking for help. "I'd be glad to help young William," Thomas replied evenly. "He can join our Sunday sessions." Word of the banker's son attending the Beckett school spread like wildfire. Soon, even prosperous families were sending their children, drawn by reports of the unique teaching methods and remarkable progress of the students. One hot July afternoon, Reverend Walsh visited their cabin. Charlotte tensed, remembering his disapproval at their wedding, but the minister's expression was humble. "I owe you both an apology," he began, accepting the glass of cool water Charlotte offered. "I judged hastily and harshly. What you've built here." He gestured at the children's drawings on the walls, the shelves of borrowed books, the arithmetic problems on the blackboard. "This is God's work. It's just neighbors helping neighbors," Thomas said simply. "That's exactly what it is," the Reverend agreed. "And it's what our community needs. I've come to ask if you'd consider holding a session at the church. We have more space and—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It would signal to everyone that what you're doing is valued and welcomed." Charlotte and Thomas exchanged glances. The church that had witnessed their forced union now offered partnership. "We'll think on it," Thomas said diplomatically. The next surprise came from an unexpected source. Charlotte was at the general store when Mrs. Patterson, the shopkeeper's wife, approached her. "Mrs. Beckett," she said formally, then softened. "Charlotte, I wonder if I might speak freely?" Charlotte nodded, curious. When the marriage was arranged, I thought it cruel. A refined girl like you with a stable hand." She twisted her hands nervously. "But I've watched you these months. You've bloomed. And Thomas, why, he's become quite the gentleman. Still does honest work, mind you, but the way he speaks now, the way he carries himself." "He was always a gentleman," Charlotte said quietly. "He just needed someone to see it." Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. "That's what I'm understanding. We've been fools, judging by occupation rather than character. My husband and I would be honored if you'd take tea with us Sunday after church." It was an olive branch, a welcome back into respectable society. Charlotte accepted graciously, though she felt the irony keenly. She'd had to fall to rise, had to lose society's approval to find something infinitely more valuable. The true test came in August when Judge Harrison Whitmore himself appeared at their door. Charlotte's heart hammered as she saw her father's carriage approaching. Thomas was in the field, but as if sensing her need, he appeared at her side before the judge could dismount. "Judge Whitmore," Thomas said evenly, neither subservient nor hostile. Charlotte's father looked older, grayer. His eyes took in the improved cabin, the thriving garden, the obvious signs of prosperity and happiness. His gaze lingered on Charlotte. Her simple dress clean and neat, her face sun-kissed and healthy, her hand naturally finding Thomas's. "I've come to see my daughter," the judge said stiffly. "You've come to our home," Thomas corrected gently. "You're welcome if you come in peace." The judge's jaw tightened, but he nodded. They sat on the porch Charlotte had adorned with climbing roses, drinking lemonade in tense silence. Finally, the judge spoke. "Your mother misses you." "She knows where I live," Charlotte replied. "I've heard about your school. People speak highly of it, of both of you." The words seemed to pain him. "Education should be for everyone," Charlotte said, "not just those who can afford it." Her father flinched. "I suppose you hate me for what I did." Charlotte considered this. "I did hate you, for a time, but Thomas taught me that hate is like carrying hot coals. It only burns the one holding them." "I taught her that," Thomas said, surprised. "I thought you taught me." Despite everything, Charlotte smiled. "We teach each other." The judge watched this exchange with something like wonder. "You're happy." It wasn't a question. "Happier than I ever was in your house," Charlotte said honestly. "You meant to punish me, Father. Instead, you freed me. You gave me purpose, partnership, and love. So no, I don't hate you. I pity you, because you'll never understand what true wealth looks like." Judge Whitmore stood abruptly. "I see I've wasted my time." "Have you?" Thomas asked quietly. "You came here hoping for what, sir? For Charlotte to be miserable? To beg to come home? She is home. You could choose to be part of that or continue to let pride rob you of your daughter." The judge stared at Thomas as if seeing him for the first time. "You dare lecture me?" "I dare speak truth," Thomas replied. Something I learned from your daughter. She has your intelligence, your strength of will, but she also has compassion you never taught her. That she learned despite you, not because of you." For a moment, Charlotte thought her father might strike Thomas. Instead, his shoulders sagged. "Your mother truly does miss you," he said quietly. "She's been unwell. Seeing you might help." Charlotte's anger wavered. "She can visit. She's always welcome here." The judge nodded stiffly and turned to go. At his carriage, he paused. "The Hartley's boy, Samuel. He married the Pemberton girl. She ran off with a traveling salesman after 3 months. Old Martin Hartley says I saved him from that fate, at least." He climbed into his carriage without waiting for a response. After he left, Charlotte and Thomas sat in silence, processing the strange visit. "He'll never apologize," Charlotte said finally. "But he came," Thomas pointed out. "That's something." 2 weeks later, Charlotte's mother arrived in a hired buggy, nervous but determined. The reunion was tearful, and when she saw how Charlotte lived, simple but clean, filled with purpose and joy, she wept again. "I was so wrong," she whispered. "You're radiant, my dear." And Thomas, she watched him teaching a group of children, patient and kind. "He's not what we thought at all." "He never was," Charlotte said. "You just never looked past his occupation." Her mother became a regular visitor, eventually even helping with the teaching. She had a gift for music and started a small choir with the children. As autumn approached, Thomas received an offer that stunned them both. Mr. Jameson, who owned the largest mercantile in town, wanted to hire Thomas as a clerk and bookkeeper. "You've proven yourself reliable and quick with figures," Jameson explained. "More importantly, people trust you. That's good for business." It was a respectable position, a massive step up from stable hand. Thomas discussed it with Charlotte late into the night. "It would mean more money," he said. "We could expand the school properly, maybe even hire another teacher." "But do you want it?" Charlotte asked. "You love working with the horses, being outdoors." Thomas pulled her close. "I love building our future more, and Jameson says I can keep the early morning stable work if I want. Best of both worlds." The announcement that Thomas Beckett would be the new clerk at Jameson's mercantile sent ripples through the community. The stable hand who'd married the judge's daughter as punishment had become a respected businessman and educator. At the harvest dance that year, Charlotte and Thomas entered together, heads high. The same people who had witnessed their forced wedding now saw them dance together, lost in each other's eyes. When Thomas spun Charlotte, her laughter rang out pure and joyful, and more than one person commented on what a handsome couple they made. "Who would have thought?" Mrs. Morrison murmured to her husband. "That stable hand and the judge's daughter, they're the happiest couple in town." "Maybe that's because they chose each other," her husband replied thoughtfully. "Not at first, perhaps, but every day since." As the evening wound down, Judge Whitmore made an unexpected appearance. He approached Thomas directly. "Mr. Beckett," he said formally, "I wonder if you might help me with a legal matter. I need someone who can read and write well, who understands both the educated and working folks. A sort of liaison." It was the closest to an apology he would ever offer, acknowledging Thomas as an equal, a man of worth. Thomas considered carefully. "I'll think on it, sir. Charlotte and I make decisions together." The judge nodded slowly, as it should be in a marriage. That night, as they walked home under the stars, Charlotte marveled at how far they'd come. The punishment marriage had become a love story. The stable hand had become a respected businessman. The spoiled judge's daughter had become a beloved teacher. Together, they'd built something neither could have achieved alone. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked suddenly. "The life you could have had?" Charlotte stopped walking, turned to face him fully. "The only thing I regret is that it took Father's cruelty to bring us together. Everything else, every struggle, every hard day, every small victory. I'd do it all again to be here with you." Thomas kissed her under the vast prairie sky, and Charlotte knew that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as punishments, and the best love stories began with the most unlikely matches. The first anniversary of their wedding day dawned crisp and clear. Charlotte woke to find Thomas already up, sitting at their table with something in his hands. As she approached, she saw it was a leather-bound book, its cover tooled with delicate wildflower designs. "What's this?" she asked, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. Thomas looked up, his green eyes soft with emotion. "It's for you. For us, really. I've been working on it for months." Charlotte opened the book carefully. The first page bore Thomas's now confident handwriting. "Our story, from punishment to promise. For my beloved Charlotte, who taught me that words have power, and love has even more. Your devoted husband, Thomas." The following pages contained their story, written in Thomas's clear hand. He'd chronicled everything: their awkward beginning, the first lessons, the hard winter, the growth of their school, their love blooming like prairie flowers after rain. Interspersed were pressed flowers from their land, sketches of their cabin, their students, moments from their life together. "Thomas," Charlotte breathed, tears streaming down her face. "This is beautiful." "There are empty pages at the end," he said, pulling her onto his lap. "For all the stories yet to come." Charlotte kissed him deeply, marveling at this man who'd gone from barely writing his name to creating this treasure. When they finally pulled apart, she had news of her own. "I have something to tell you," she said, suddenly shy, "about those future stories. One of them might arrive in about 7 months. Thomas went very still. "Charlotte, are you saying—" She nodded, watching joy transform his face. He lifted her, spun her around their small kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at once. "A baby," he whispered in wonder. "Our baby." "Our baby," Charlotte confirmed. The next chapter of our story. The news spread quickly through their community. The children in their school were thrilled at the prospect of a baby to fuss over. Mrs. Kowalski immediately began knitting tiny garments. Even Judge Whitmore, when informed by his wife, sent a note of congratulations along with a generous gift of money for the child's future education. As autumn progressed, Thomas threw himself into preparing for their child. He expanded their bedroom, crafted a beautiful cradle from prairie oak, and read every book on child-rearing Charlotte could find. His combination of excitement and nervousness was endearing. "What if I don't know how to be a father?" he confessed one night. "I barely remember my own." Charlotte took his face in her hands. "You'll be wonderful. Look how patient you are with our students, how gentle with the animals, how loving with me. Our child will be blessed to have you." The school had grown so much they'd finally accepted Reverend Walsh's offer of the church space twice a week. Thomas had hired an assistant at the Mercantile, allowing him more time for teaching. Together, he and Charlotte had created a curriculum that blended traditional academics with practical skills, producing students who could read Shakespeare and fix a wagon wheel with equal competence. One November evening, as Charlotte worked on lesson plans despite Thomas's protests that she should rest, a knock came at their door. Thomas opened it to find Samuel Hartley standing in the cold, hat in hand. Charlotte stiffened, remembering this man who'd tried to claim her like property. But the Samuel before them looked different, older, humbled, his arrogance replaced by something like desperation. "Mrs. Beckett, Mr. Beckett," he said formally. "I apologize for calling so late. I wonder if I might speak with you." Thomas looked to Charlotte, who nodded slowly. They invited him in, and Samuel sat awkwardly in their kitchen, so different from the man who'd swaggered through her father's parlor. "I need help," he said simply. "I can't read, not properly. Oh, I can manage simple things, but contracts, legal documents—" He swallowed hard. "I've been cheated twice now by men who knew I couldn't understand what I was signing. My father's furious, says I'm a disappointment. But I heard about your school, how you teach adults too, and I thought—" "You thought what?" Charlotte asked, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Samuel met her eyes. "I thought maybe the woman I was too proud to truly see might be gracious enough to teach the fool who couldn't see her worth." It was the nearest thing to an apology she'd ever get from him. Charlotte looked at Thomas, who shrugged slightly. Her choice, as always. "Everyone deserves education," Charlotte said finally. "You can join our adult evening sessions. But Samuel, understand this. In our classroom, everyone is equal. Former stable hands and ranchers' sons alike. Can you accept that?" "Ma'am," Samuel said quietly, "I'd be grateful just to be allowed through the door." He became one of their most dedicated students, his humility genuine. The story spread. If Samuel Hartley could swallow his pride to learn from the Becketts, anyone could. Their evening classes filled with adults hungry for education they'd been denied. Winter came gentler this year, though Charlotte's expanding condition made everything more challenging. Thomas fussed over her constantly, recruiting their students to help with heavier chores. The children took their responsibilities seriously, proud to help the teachers who'd given them so much. On a snowy February night, Charlotte's labor began. Thomas, who'd faced blizzards and broncos with steady nerves, nearly panicked. Fortunately, Mrs. Kowalski arrived quickly, along with the midwife, Mrs. Chen, whose husband ran the laundry. "First babies take time," Mrs. Chen assured Thomas, who paced like a caged wolf. "Make yourself useful, boil water, prepare clean linens." For 12 hours, Thomas did everything asked of him, his face tight with worry. Charlotte, between pains, marveled at this man who'd whispered poetry to her through the door, who'd held her hand until Mrs. Chen shooed him out, who'd promised their child would know only love and opportunity. When their son finally arrived, healthy and loud, Thomas was the first person Charlotte wanted to see. He entered tentatively, his eyes wide with awe as Mrs. Chen placed the baby in his arms. "A son," he whispered, tears rolling down his cheeks. "Charlotte, we have a son." They named him James Harrison Beckett. James for Thomas's father, Harrison for Charlotte's. A bridge between past and future. Judge Whitmore, when he visited a week later, stood speechless at the honor. "I don't deserve this," he said roughly, holding his grandson with surprising gentleness. "No," Charlotte agreed calmly. "But James deserves a grandfather who might learn to be better than he was." "Can you do that?" The judge nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Spring brought more growth. The State Education Board, hearing of their innovative school, sent an inspector. Mr. Terrence Williams arrived expecting to find a quaint frontier effort. Instead, he discovered students who could recite poetry while demonstrating practical mathematics, who understood both classic literature and agricultural science. "This is remarkable," he told Charlotte and Thomas. "Would you consider writing a guide for other frontier schools? The state would pay for publication and distribution." Thomas and Charlotte exchanged glances, remembering when he couldn't write his name. "We'd be honored," Thomas said. As summer arrived, they held their first graduation ceremony for students moving on to higher education in larger towns. 8 young people, who might have remained illiterate without the Beckett School, stood proud with their certificates. Anna Kowalski, now 16 and headed to Teachers College, gave the graduation address. "Mr. and Mrs. Beckett taught us more than reading and writing," she said. "They taught us that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go. That education is not a privilege for the few, but a right for all. That love and respect matter more than money or position." In the audience, Judge Whitmore wiped his eyes, his arm around his wife. The transformation in him over the past months had been remarkable, driven by his love for his grandson and gradual recognition of what Charlotte had built from the ashes of his cruelty. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Charlotte and Thomas sat on their porch, baby James sleeping in Thomas's arms. Their students played in the yard, their parents chatted over lemonade, and the whole scene glowed with community and accomplishment. "Look what we built," Charlotte said softly, her head on Thomas's shoulder. "Look what love built," Thomas corrected. "Starting with 2 people who had every reason to resent their situation but chose to see possibility instead." Charlotte picked up the leather journal Thomas had given her, now filled with more stories, more growth, more love. She turned to a fresh page and began to write. "Year 2 begins with hope. Our school thrives, our son grows strong, and our love deepens daily. The punishment that brought us together has become the greatest gift of our lives. We are proof that education can transform anyone, that love can bloom in the unlikeliest ground, and that sometimes what seems like an ending is really just a beginning." Thomas read over her shoulder, then added in his own hand, "And the best chapters are still to come." As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Charlotte reflected on their journey. From that terrible morning when her father pronounced his judgment, Through all the struggles and triumphs, to this moment of perfect contentment, every step had led them here. "I love you," she told Thomas, the words as fresh and vital as the first time she'd said them. "And I love you," he replied, shifting James to one arm so he could pull Charlotte closer. Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come. In the distance, their students' laughter rang out across the prairie, a sound of joy and promise. The stable hand and the judge's daughter had become teachers, partners, parents, and pillars of their community. Their punishment had become their purpose. Their forced marriage had become a true partnership, and their love story, written in perseverance, respect, and the transformative power of education, would inspire generations to come. The empty pages in their journal waited to be filled, but Charlotte knew whatever came next, they would face it together. For in choosing each other every day, in building something meaningful from nothing, they had discovered the greatest truth of all. Love isn't about what you're given, but what you choose to create together. And they had created something beautiful indeed. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect with fellow listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more heartwarming frontier stories. And please share your thoughts about Charlotte and Thomas's journey. Did their transformation touch your heart as much as it touched mine? Let me know in the comments.